Okay, guys, we are back with the Coach Trap podcast. This week, me and Dan Williams are very fortunate to be joined by Phil Adderley. Now, Phil is an alcohol expert. I can't wait to find out about his journey, how he got into this space, and then ultimately how he can help others. So, Phil, thank you so much for joining us. I'd love to know a little bit more about you, a little bit more about how you got into this space, and then obviously we can help you. We can help you market yourself as best as possible with Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So certainly, yeah. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Really appreciate it. So as a coach, I focus on people who are aged 40 plus, drinking 50 plus units of alcohol each week. And what you tend to find in that group, probably career aspirations have been compromised, and the career is probably stagnated. And quite often, as a coach, that's kind of where I sort of fitted in and how I sort of got into that niche. And so people who were caught into that trap, they're probably recognizing that they've got poor quality sleep, worrying about stuff constantly, the memory suffering, relationships will be strained, they're looking older than they should, illnesses linger, ability to get stuff done's reduced, and opportunities are just passing them by. And what's really interesting is, at the age of 40, you're not even halfway through your active life. And so you've got a crazy amount of time left in front of you. And so it's all about setting yourself up to flourish for the future rather than just living a life that's going to be full of regret. So a bit more about my background. So I'm in manufacturing. So I've been in engineering for almost 30 years. It's all been around sort of aerospace, worked my way up through the management structure. I'm in like your traditional way. And so it was all about putting the hard yards in. So along that way, there was lots of knocks, lots of stress, and probably like an awful lot of people, you fall into the trap of, having a few beers after work. And then it snowballs, and pretty much you're blind to the problem. And that was very much the issue that I was having. Other people can recognize it, but you're in denial. And as we're probably all aware, like alcohol is not a friend when you're in that sort of situation, because the issues just drag on, and alcohol will sort of take you down along the way. So I was like a regular drinker. I wouldn't class myself as an alcoholic. I wasn't bothered about daytime drinking or anything like that. It was all about PM after work, de-stress, and then it's just that cycle that gets bigger and bigger, and over time it sort of chips away at your real version of who you are. So like we touched on, people talk about moderation, and why don't you just have one or two? And like as we spoke before, is like when you're caught in that loop, you can't moderate, because alcohol doesn't allow that to happen. And yeah, and going back to like, the career aspirations of why I sort of got into being a coach now is, again, you're blind to what's actually going on, and you've got a career path that's going upwards. It does start to stagnate, and suddenly, for myself, there was an opportunity which I should have got. I should have absolutely nailed it, and I failed. And at that point, it was like, oh shit, something's got to change. So I went and got coaching myself, and it was somebody who I knew, and alcohol was never mentioned during the coaching process. And again, it's almost like the shame element, because you don't want to sort of peel back all these layers. But in my mind, as I was going through the coaching process, I was like, alcohol's my problem. If I can fix that, everything else will just fall into place. And it is so true, So
Yeah.
even though the guy who coached me, we never spoke about, what I drank. It was all about fulfillment, and trying to get away from all the fears that you have in life. And I was able to sort of wean myself off it, again, which was difficult and it took time. But now I'm probably like about 270 days into the cycle, and life's actually really exciting now. Whereas before you're in survival mode, and so the world's completely different to me. And opportunities, doors are opening all over the place. 12 months ago, I would never have imagined would have opened. So yeah, sorry about the waffle, but yeah, that's my background.
Phil, no need to apologise. The hairs on my back and my neck were stand up, and I absolutely love that. And what I think's amazing about coaches, certain specific ones, and Dan, feel free to talk about this. You can't lead others down a path if you haven't walked it yourself, if that makes sense. So it's like there's no fake guru, there's no, any of that sort of stuff. You've walked that line, and you're happy to talk about others, and you want to pass on what you've learned. I think that's so incredibly powerful. One question I've got for you though, Phil, me and you are the same sort of generation, the same sort of type of guy, if you like, football fan.
Yeah.
Dan's a little younger. Do you think this is something, and Dan, I'd love to know your opinion on this, because drinking consumption levels have changed a lot. The best example I can give, Dan, is that nightclubs have shut down in, unbelievable amounts, if that makes sense, in UK. Pubs are shutting down every week. Is this a generational thing, Phil, or is this, or does it not? Does it not look at men and women? Does it not look at ages? What's your lens on that?
Interesting. I've got like two observations. So I've got two children, daughter who's early 20s, son who's late teens, and how they live their life is completely different to how I was at that age. When I was at that age, I was out every night drinking, but they're totally different. They're the opposite, and a lot of their friends are the same. They still have nights out, and they'll come back and get a hangover, but it's few and far between. Second observation I've got is like just been on holiday. So we flew from Bristol Airport last week. It was an early flight. So we're at the airport 5 o'clock in the morning and the bar's heaving. And there's people our age, Greg, drinks lined up. And you're thinking, I'm looking at it thinking, bloody hell, your days are right off before you've even started. And it wasn't just like one group of people, it was across the board. And, you think like, certainly the UK culture is different, to where we went on holiday, it's a different mindset at all. Because like we actually went to a football match in Italy, and as you're going to the ground, where in the UK it's beers and pies, over there it's people having like a glass of wine and a tub of olives. It's a totally
I've seen
different
that.
different
Yeah.
approach. And yeah, so I think to answer your question, I think there is a generational difference. So I don't know, like for Dan, for yourself, then, what your experience is.
Yeah, I think there definitely is a difference, but I would say we still go out and we still drink, but we just don't drink as much or as frequently. I think that's the main difference. Like if I was going out for a birthday or whatever, I'd have like 2 drinks, maybe 3 drinks max. But that's interesting as well with your targeting for your content. That's something to talk about as well, and that's something to bear in mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was on a works leaving do a couple of months ago, and I was the only one not drinking. And of course, people know that I don't drink at work. I kept it quiet at first, but eventually they all know, and they're all quite envious as well. But you still get the comments about Phil being the boring bastard because he's not drinking. But the reality is, after they've all had a few, they're coming up to me talking about how have you done it, So you know that in front of everybody, they're trying to show off, but reality and deep down is it's like, how have you done it, Phil? How have you managed to break the cycle? So, it is actually quite powerful to be able to do it.
That's amazing. Dan, I've got a question for you then. I'll come back to Phil. So with all the data that we know that consumption levels in younger age groups are a little different to what they are to, say, mine and Phil's age group and my parents' age group, would you go about marketing to everyone? Would you go about marketing to a certain niche, a certain type of person? How would you go about that?
Yeah, I think with this, it would be more useful if it was with a niche because it's just going to resonate that little bit more. Like if you say, I coach 40 to 60-year-olds about how to stop, you know, having those couple of beers after work, something like that. And people are going to obviously, there's quite a few people who do that. And when they see that, they're going to be like, okay, that's me. And as long as you're like promising some sort of good outcome from that, so you
Mm.
could say like, it's going to make you 20% more productive or anything like that. Any sort of like data, you've got to back that up with something beneficial. That's going to really resonate as well. And yeah, I think it's as simple as that, really.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Phil, what I thought would be a really good exercise if I tell you a story. Okay, I've had my own, I wouldn't say issues with alcohol, my own story, if that makes sense. I thought if I tell you the story, Phil, you could tell me the sort of advice that you'd give to someone like me, because I imagine lots of people would resonate with the sort of story that I've got. And Dan, you could maybe think about how to market that. How would you pinpoint people like me? What sort of storytelling aspect would there be behind it? What social media channels would you use? What hooks, right? So Phil, I was sober for 176 days. In short, me and Dan did a podcast with someone, Mike. Mike Mayer, an amazing sobriety coach, and he said about doing the dry January, which I imagine lots of people do. I wouldn't say I had a problem with alcohol. And looking back now, was it a problem? By UK standards, it wasn't. By world standards, it was. And that's something that we can talk about. Okay. So I'll drink every day, but I'd just have a beer, glass of wine, maybe a few more on the weekend. Okay. I did the dry January and I felt great. I had clarity. I was working better. I was losing weight. I was a better husband. I was really creative as well. I noticed I was a lot more creative than I was. All right. That motivated me to go 60 days, 90 days. Then easily I got into a cycle of actually even saying to everyone that I know and all my friends and family that, look, maybe I'm not going to drink again. I noticed a few things. One, on the flip side, I'm a football fanatic. I lost a little bit of interest in football. So I noticed that I'd associate having a beer, no, going to the football and having a beer. So when there was no going to the football and no watching it in pubs because I wasn't drinking, interest in football went. And that also had a negative aspect of my relationship with some of my friends as well, if that makes sense, right? But the real killer was this wedding anniversary. I told my wife, you can go wherever you want. She goes, right. She booked Ibiza, San Antonio, no, Playa d'Embossa, sorry, to see Calvin Harris at Bushwa on the 200th day I was sober. And I didn't know what to do. Okay. And I imagine that's a position that lots of guys find themselves in. Wedding, stag do, works do, Christmas do, all those sort of events, if that makes sense. Yeah. So let's look at this from like different lenses. I would say, Dan, that's a normal person's problem when it comes to drinking, yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Not fitting in with friends, worried about coming to an event, like Phil said about not fitting in, right? Because I think that was a big thing for me, was social conforming with drinking. Phil, tell me a little bit more. What would you tell someone who had a problem like that?
It's a great question, actually. So your anxiety then for going to Ibiza then. So how would you have scaled that then? What was your anxiety on
Oh,
0 to
wow,
10?
a good one. Okay, so I would say this. So I love Ibiza. It's my favourite place on the planet. In the past, I've been going for 15 to 16 years, even more. When I would go in my teens, it would be that cliche, getting flat out drunk, staying up all night or whatever, and you associate having great times with being drunk. As a guy from Britain, I think you have this feeling that you have to do it. You'll only enjoy yourself more if you get drunk. And I feel sometimes you're conditioned to feel that way. As you get older, obviously the hangovers are worse, and you're a little bit more cautious and wary of your behaviour. So I'd say, yeah, a 9. I was really worried about it going almost to the point where I was going to say to my wife, I don't want to go, if that makes sense. So yeah, I was really, really worried. And I imagine that's a similar feeling that lots of people go is you don't want to let down your wife. You don't want to have that FOMO feeling of like fear of missing out. You want to conform. You're slightly conditioned to act like that. There's lots of different ways to look at that.
Yeah, because, lots of people along the alcohol-free route, they'll have setbacks. There's times when, that they have a good run and then they lose it. What was interesting, with what you've just said is, and quite often when I am coaching people, we're talking about alcohol, it's trying to make sure you're not exposing yourself to those situations where there is a trigger. And generally, you encourage clients to make sure you have an exit route. It's quite difficult when your wife has booked a holiday and it's almost like you probably feel duty bound to do as you're told. And was she aware of your position when it came to alcohol?
Yeah, she obviously knew I wasn't drinking. She was really supportive throughout the whole thing. I think she just thought I was going to go and be normal. I think she thought I was just going to go and be like the Greg she's known for 6 years. And I had to like remind her that, look, something's changed here. I'm a little different now. And she was actually, I was worried about her not being so understanding, and she was. So that's cognitive dissonance, isn't it? The idea of like the angel on one shoulder and the devil on the other. That was just worry. And actually, that worry wasn't quite there. And that's where
Yeah.
coaching would be great, wasn't it? Because they would actually say, look, she'll be understanding. She'll know. I think there's something you said about socially, conforming,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. It's a tough one. And I found that really hard with the football,
I was going to
massively.
say though, so so for the trip to Ibiza then, so what was your biggest fear?
Biggest fear was going out on one night, going absolutely crazy and ruining the rest of the trip. In fact, makes it having one big blowout
Yeah.
or or having a few drinks and realizing that my levels of consuming alcohol or functioning or, however you want to call that, were different, maybe not as high. My tolerance for alcohol was a lot less, and worried that I'd be a complete write-off, embarrassed, all those sort of things. If you have a few drinks, you just worry about that level.
Yeah.
And it was all worry and scenario thinking in my mind. If I go to a nightclub, if I have too many shots or I have too many drinks and I lose it or I can't behave or, you know, all those sort of worries, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, because quite often when we do the coaching, we call it like the ambivalent seesaw of the decisions of that you're going to make between having a drink and not having a drink. What you're going to gain and what you're losing, and quite often once you sort of weigh everything, it also always swings as in. There's no way I'm going to have a drink because I want to go there and enjoy myself. And quite often when we start doing that on the coaching, you start seeing these light bulbs triggering and people thinking, Christ, I really don't want to have a drink. So when you went to Ibiza then, did you drink?
I did, but however, I drunk in moderation a lot more than I did. And like I said, I seeked a little bit of advice. It wasn't professional advice, just sort of like, like a friendly advice from Mike, someone that me and Dan know. And he said that you'll never drink like you used to again, and I couldn't drink as much as I could have done in the past, by the way. So I was almost full at a certain level. And this is really interesting. I didn't enjoy the feeling of being drunk. I didn't enjoy the feeling of the buzz anymore. Whereas in the past, this can sound really crazy, shut off voices in my mind or dull me or make me quiet. So I didn't enjoy that feeling. I felt like it blunted me, if that makes sense. Like it was stopping me from functioning as well, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, because I've got somebody who I know, and they went to a comedy festival a few months ago, and they had the fear of basically every night was going to get messy, and so we had a bit of coaching before he went, and he actually went and alcohol free the whole weekend, and he said it was like the best festival he's been to because he was actually present, he was able to absorb everything and remember it.
That's amazing. So, Dan, you've got a great scenario there. People that are worried about social situations were built up to, in the UK to be conditioned to think we have to win, drink, lose, drink, get a job promotion, drink, go to a festival, drink, etc., etc. How would you model that? How would you promote that? How would you market it?
Yeah, I think the most important thing, the first thing for Phil to do to attract these kinds of people is kind of associate yourself and your face with drinking or not drinking, if that makes sense. Because it's interesting, you almost always target those people, but you have nothing on your LinkedIn that has anything to do with alcohol or drinking or anything like that, which is quite interesting. And then the second thing is just in your content, you're just calling out the problem. So hooks like, have you drank 4 of the 7 past days? Maybe this is what to do about it, something like that,
Okay.
because obviously that's going to attract the right people that you're trying to attract. And you don't need to go into it anything like straight with my content is only for self-identifying alcoholics. It's for anyone who kind of resonates with the symptoms of being one. Because as you said before, some people don't actually realize they are, or they don't realize that alcohol is actually inhibiting their life and their career and stuff like that. And you can only show them in the hooks, if that makes sense. And then they think that's me and they realize. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing is just the hooks, calling out the problem. Calling out context as well is really important because storytelling is brilliant. It's been brilliant for the last, however many millennium that we've been here. And it's still brilliant now. So yeah.
Yeah. Phil, there was one thing I think would be amazing is that story that you said about your friend going to the festival. That
Yeah.
story in short form content. Are you worried about going to this event? This is what this person felt. This is what I told them. This was the result. That's it, isn't it, Dan? If that makes sense. It's like, and I put that in a 30 seconds. So a picture of the festival. Are you worried about being this? It's the light bulb stop the scroll moment. And it's the moment after they dial in after that 0.37 seconds, that mere exposure effect that they're dialed in, if that makes sense. And that's what got me, even when you were talking about that, I was interested. I could feel I was talking about the hairs on my back of my neck stand up. I was focusing, if that makes sense. I wanted to know more. And that's what this is, Dan, isn't it? People don't want to buy you. They want to
Hmm.
buy the problems that you can fix. And obviously you've had those problems yourself and you've lived in them, even with the football and stuff. So
Yep.
Dan, anywhere else that you would go with that? Any other points that you would maybe add?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for coaches, especially with alcohol and things like that people don't want to talk about is people engaging is more difficult because it is kind of a problem. It's all about the DMs for coaches is what I would say. Because obviously people don't want to open up and say, this really helps me or anything publicly in the content, but they will in the DMs once they've seen you enough times to trust you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's
I
it.
think the big thing is just not worrying about engagement numbers. Worry about if there is people that you can help in your
Mm.
audience, like
Yeah.
followers, viewers, anything like that,
So that's
and be
great.
ready to DM them. Yeah,
Phil, I've
go on,
got
Greg.
two questions for you. One, I would love to know if you've got any take homes for anyone that are listening, any activities that they can take home or somewhere they can look, some inspiration to really help them. And then second, or any questions that you've maybe got for Dan along the lines of what we've been talking about.
Yeah, so I think activity-wise, for people who are caught in that loop and they're struggling to sort of break it, there is the Dry app. I think, a lot of people probably are familiar with it, and they have various events on there. And so the guy who runs that, that's the guy who sort of trained me for coaching. So that's a good source of kind of inspiration because there's lots of people on there going through the same sort of process, and people shouldn't be fearful of failure because a learning opportunity, and being part of the dry community, they get a lot of support and backing from that. To your second sort of question, and this is like probably the interesting one for marketing, and we've probably touched on it already, is that a lot of people who have this issue, they're blind to it, and there's a lot of denial because they'll have people telling that there's an issue. And I was exactly the same. I've got wife saying you drink too much. My instant response, no, I don't. And then you start logging it thinking, oh shit, I do drink too much. But you still carry that denial and the shame aspect. And I think when it comes to, this is the difficult bit when it comes to sort of the marketing element, is trying to get people to almost like take that shutter down, and have the confidence to actually come forward and say, I think you can help me. And like, we touched on earlier, almost like, the return on investment for the coaching, you're getting it back because the amount you spend on alcohol is crazy. The amount you spend on coaching is totally insignificant on the scale of things. And the benefits that you get are massive, but it's just trying to get people to see that and recognize it.
Yeah, that's a good point. Dan, I've got a question for you. Would shock and awe tactics of alcohol work? We talked about denial. I think sometimes when things are in your face, sometimes you can't ignore it. I've got a great example of this. So I saw a picture the other day and it's of Woodstock. So the original Woodstock was 1970s. I might get the date wrong. Jimi Hendrix headlining, and everyone is there with six packs. By the way, they all look lean, athletic. They did another one in 2000 and whenever it was. They're all overweight. They're all drinking. Is that like a good shock and awe tactic of like, this is what happens to you when you drink to that level? This is what happens to people when they're not drinking. Going along those sort of lines, Dan, tell me a little bit more. Would something like that work?
I think it really depends on the person, the personality type that you're trying to attract. You could potentially do that, or you could potentially go kind of the opposite direction with, this was me when I was drinking every night, whatever, and something like that. And this was me after kind of stopping, all the benefits, listing all the benefits, and being a little bit more softer in that approach. Just telling people your experience with the thing that they're doing and the benefit of stopping it, if that makes sense.
That's
But you could go either way. It really
that's
depends on the person.
Yeah, because obviously with alcohol, there are so many stats, aren't there, Phil? I mean, we could talk about this all day. I saw an
Yes.
amazing one about A&E, and how alcohol is the highest, it draws more money away from the NHS than any other illness or anything. It's alcohol. And you're thinking, wow, like we have a problem. It's a
Mm.
nationwide problem. And is that the sort of shock and awe tactics, and when you're talking about mere exposure effect or stopping the scroll, that makes someone go, wow, that's insane. We need to do something about this. Is that the sort of thing that breaks that thing where they don't want to admit it? Or I mean, here's another really great one which shocked me. Is if you look at what the recommended daily allowance is for, based on the, if you look at a can of beer down, it's got it on the back of the can, all right? You actually look how many units that is a week. I think that's not a lot. That's
Mm.
quite scary, by the way. But by the standards of having a beer every day after work or drinking at football or going out on a session, actually you take that back and you look at you like, that's not a lot at all.
No,
Like that's
no.
scary for me. Like, and is that one of the things, Phil, that you think would work? Is actually maybe just reminding them, if you have a bottle of wine a day, and lots of people that I know, that we all know do,
Yeah.
you're putting yourself in massive danger.
Well, it is, you look at a bottle of wine a day, that's almost like your weekly, allowance, if you like, and that was the issue I was having. It was like I was nailing that in a day kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's just interesting, before we sort of wrap up, because I have a day job as well, like we already mentioned, and, we talk about the undercover element of people don't wanna sort of expose themselves. Interesting, 'cause there was a lady at work, and she actually came up to me and sort of said, "Oh, I've seen what you're doing on Instagram." And I'm thinking, "Oh, she's gonna start sort of taking the mickey out of me." And she was like, "I think it's brilliant," and it's like, there's so many people here who should like come and talk to you. And, and she like saying, "I wish you could help my husband," because I think what you're doing is fantastic, keep doing it. And it was like, wow, when you get those little comments and you think, there's an awful lot of people out there who need that help, possibly want it, but they're trapped. They're trapped in that cycle and they don't know how to get
Mm,
out of it.
I think it goes back to what I was saying about the DMs rather than the actual comments on the post itself. Is
Yeah,
that when people trust you, they're happy to tell you about their problems, tell you about other people's problems,
yeah,
be more focused on that really. But what's interesting as well is you could get a lot of referrals as well from it, from people like the person that came up to you, like my husband, my brother, whatever. is struggling. And yeah, I think it's just building that trust. You've got to really think of content as that, and think of DMs as kind of conversing that into clients and helping people, basically.
Good point. Phil, just before we finish up, I'd love to know where people can find you. But how does coaching with you work? Is it one-to-one? Is it cohort of people? Is it a course? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Very much one to one. So it is all online. Yeah, so people can find me. It's philadderleycoaching.com, and it's all the same, whether it's on Instagram. There's a page on LinkedIn as well, but pretty much Instagram's probably the best place for me at the moment. And that will sort of spread out over time. But yeah, so that's sort of who I am and what I'm about. So if it does resonate with anybody, by all means, get in contact with me.
Lovely, lovely. Dan, any more questions for Phil before we go?
I think that all makes sense, to be honest. Have you got any more questions for us, Phil?
No, it's been excellent. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Great stuff. Guys, a real powerful session. And Phil, some amazing work that you're doing there. Guys, remember, whatever you do, don't fall into the coach trap.